Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Josephine Franklin. I'm Associate Director of Professional Development at NASSP. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Our topic today is terrorism, building a proactive school community. Before we start, I'm going to give you a few housekeeping tips. The following are a few technical notes of information to assist you during the webinar. If you have a technical problem during the broadcast, please call GoToWebinar support at 855-352-9002 and provide today's webinar ID number 108-252-595. As you participate in this webinar, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NASSP webinar. You can also follow NASSP on Twitter. Our handle is @NASSP. We are also on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. During the webinar today, we invite your questions. Please submit them using the question box on the GoToWebinar panel. We will respond to as many questions as time permits. If we run out of time to answer all questions, we will respond by email following the broadcast. We are recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website in the near future at www.nassp.org/webinar videos. Today's webinar is the second in a series around coping with terrorism or tragedy. Our first webinar on this topic was talking about terrorism with your school community. The presenters were Dr. Judith Myers-Walls, an educator whose expertise includes the impact of war and peace on children and families, and Dr. Roxanne Cohen-Silver, a psychologist and international expert on larger collective events such as terror attacks, war, and natural disasters across the world. This webinar is now available in our archive at nassp.org/webinar videos. Today's conversation will be from the practitioner's perspective. We are pleased to have with us Kathy Bonneville Hicks, Social Studies Supervisor with Arlington Public Schools in Arlington, Virginia. Kathy is going to share some instructional strategies to prepare students and teachers in the event of tragedy or terrorism. We also have Kirk Dolson, principal at Parkview High School in Sterling, Virginia. He is going to share how his community school responded in a proactive way following a recent tragedy. Kirk, we'd like to begin by telling our audience about your experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this important conversation. So as Josephine said, my name is Kirk Dolson. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the current principal of Parkview High School. I've been in education for over 15 years and held various positions within Loudoun County Public Schools. We are, as I just said, a high school in Loudoun County, about 45 minutes west of the Washington, D.C. area. If you want to advance the slide, I'll tell you a little bit about Parkview High School. Parkview is unlike any other high school in Loudoun County Public Schools. We have the largest ELL and free and reduced price lunch population among the 15 high schools within our district. The ELL population here and the percentage that you see on the screen represented is only taking into consideration our level 1 through 3 students. We are the only majority minority high school in our district, and we are predominantly Hispanic. Our school was accredited with warning in math last school year for the second year in a row, and I must say I'm proud to say that within our standards of learning scores, which is our state assessment, we went from 59% to 76% passing in math and 69% to 81% passing in reading just within 1 year. So it's a great thing to be able to share that with everyone. We are a high-need school and one of the oldest high schools in a county that is growing rapidly. Since the late 90s, Loudoun County has opened 11 of its 15 high schools. So newer schools obviously have many draws, and additionally our county has immense growth in the west and the south. And Parkview resides in the eastern portion of our county. So Parkview teachers fall into two categories, those that are new with less than 5 years experience and those that have been in the system for an extended period of time. This school year we have a large population of teachers new to the school and new to the profession itself. Additionally, we also have a new school resource officer and a new assistant principal. If you want to go ahead and advance the slide, thank you. So the specific incident that I'm going to talk about today occurred September the 4th. On September the 4th, I was attending a meeting with my supervisor, the Director of High School Education, at the Loudoun County Youth Shelter to discuss a student's academic placement for the school year. Our school day for high school students begins at 9 a.m. Elementary students begin at 7:50, and middle school students start around 8:15. During the meeting that I was attending, I received a phone call from one of my assistant principals at approximately 8:50. Normally, I receive text messages from my admin team to report issues, so I did find it a little odd that I was receiving a phone call. A second call came to me approximately 2 minutes later, along with a text message stating that our school was going on lockdown due to a crime within the community. At that point, that was all the information that I had. I was not on campus and was about 15 to 20 minutes away from school. So I immediately called my AP on her cell phone and received the information that there had indeed been a shooting in a neighborhood close to our school, and that one of our feeder elementary schools and our feeder middle school were both on lockdown given the information provided by local law enforcement. Our school resource officer had also received a call indicating that there had been a possible student shooting at approximately 8:40 at a nearby bus stop. Witnesses reported what appeared to be three young men fleeing the scene in jeans and black hoodies. So obviously this information and the limited descriptions pertain to a large portion of our student population. So with the information coming into our school between 8:45 and 8:50, as buses were arriving, my assistant principals decided to act with caution. September 4th was also the 5th day of the school year. Because we are on an A-B block schedule, we reserve the first 20 minutes each day of the first week of school to respond to schedule changes and other needs to protect instructional time. So students report to what we call homeroom these 5 days and report back to them on a semi-regular basis throughout the school year. Given that the students were still getting used to their schedules the first week of school and that this was indeed an emergency situation, my APs decided to have the students on this day immediately report to their first block class instead of homeroom because students were more apt to look at their schedules and see first block easily. Also, attendance would be easily taken via their first block classes. So an announcement was made prior to the tardy bell that all students were to report to first block, and an email was immediately sent to teachers by the assistant principals. Students were just arriving and they hurried into classrooms in an orderly fashion. In essence, we were on lockdown before the school day started. Bus drivers were taken off of their buses and parents were housed in counseling offices. Students that were en route to educational centers outside of Parkview were sent to the library for our lockdown procedures to be followed. As I was en route to the school, I spoke with my director and our public school systems information officer. I was told that they would meet me at the school as soon as possible. I then called our school resource officer. He was searching the bus that had transported students from the bus drop where the shooting had taken place. I arrived to school at approximately 9:10 that morning. The school was quiet. We were in lockdown mode with the exception of the main office. There were a few additional deputies. Within 15 minutes of my arrival, I had 6 Loudoun County Sheriff officers in my main office, the Virginia State Police, as well as the FBI. It was very clear to myself and the administrators that this was going to be an active investigation. The biggest issue when I arrived was whether or not we had a student or students with weapons in our building. So what occurred between that morning and that afternoon, as well as thereafter is a testament to the importance of trust and collaboration. Law enforcement asked for us to provide them information that would help them, in essence, solve their case. So we as school officials were most concerned, obviously, with the immediate safety of our students and staff members. I'd say together we problem solved and ascertained quickly that the suspects who were responsible for the crime were indeed not in our school. However, it was clear that some students may have had important information regarding the investigation. Again, given that it was an active investigation, I decided to keep the school on lockdown to assist law enforcement in making students accessible. At approximately 10:30 that morning, I was informed that the victim, his name was Danny, had passed. So once I was given that information, not only did we have the active investigation was going on, but we had to do some damage control and respond to the needs of the family members of Danny who are also in attendance at our school. Just some other details about the day. We fed 1,450 students lunch in 1 hour, and we tended to the friends and family of Danny as best that we could. I called for our district's crisis response team, and they reported to the school accordingly. I was able to allow them on campus given my request. And our counseling staff began to gather information regarding Danny's family members who were at our school and also our feeder schools to respond to those individual students' needs. I'll be honest that the investigation was a roller coaster that day. The lead detective had breaks all throughout the day. I can tell you that within 24 hours of the shooting, 2 young men were apprehended by law enforcement. At 2:15, I made the decision to lift our lockdown and move to a lockout. I allowed students with early release to leave the school, allowed our football team to travel to its scheduled football game in Western Virginia, and contacted parents regarding dismissal procedures that would be followed. Okay, you can advance to the next slide. So going over some of the things that we did right, I think we decided to go into a lockdown based on the information that we had and based on our need to respond to student and staff safety. Throughout the day, I communicated with parents and our community regularly. I was fortunate enough to have our public information officer and my level director in the building throughout the day. These 2 administrators were vital, I think, in our school's success throughout this event. As you can see right there, communicate is what we did. They were I held very brief and directed meetings throughout the day with my admin team and some of our teacher leaders to update the pertinent information that I could share. I used our communication system ConnectEd in English and Spanish periodically throughout the day to alert parents as to what was happening and the information that I could share them. Obviously, with a very high percentage of our student population being Hispanic, I was able to utilize my bilingual staff and use them to help make phone calls, help answer phone calls, and also speak with parents. And the social media piece, we really concentrated on what we could control. Again, social media is a tool, and it's very useful at times. Text messages that we received from teachers throughout the building were very useful. We did have a couple of minor emergencies, students becoming sick, students feeling ill, so we were able to respond to those and using some of our our cell phones that staff members had. But again, I would say that communication is definitely key. You can move on to the next slide. The partnership that we have and we still do have with all of our stakeholders, the law enforcement, parents, our school division administration, teachers, students, and the community as a whole, there was definitely a sense of trust that we had with those that were tending to this investigation. We had to obviously respond and give them the information that we could and that they felt would help them, and that's exactly what we did. It was a two-way street. They were extremely appreciative. The parents were extremely appreciative of the communication that was sent out by myself, as well as some of the other teachers that had to respond in such ways. I will say the resounding sentiment of the students, both during the event and then afterwards, was that they felt safe, and they felt safe for a multitude of reasons, but they felt safe, I think, because our teachers responded in a very orderly fashion. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And in stating those orderly fashions, the consistent procedures that we utilize, and I think all schools utilize, but especially ours were put to the test that day during our drills that we do in order to prepare students and teachers for events like this. It's my hope that no school administrator, principal, teacher, or family ever has to endure what occurred in my school community that day. But if and when that does occur, it is nice to know that you have those procedures in place, the fire drills, the emergency response drills, lockdown drills, and when you are asked to go into those types of drills, that it is just something that happens, that students respond accordingly and teachers respond accordingly. Immediately following that day, I had a debrief meeting with my staff. I shared with them the information about the student and the fact that Danny had passed that earlier that morning. I also held meetings with my admin team following that that week. I had local and community events. We collaborated with our law enforcement to hold a community event that the local sheriff's office basically spoke out and responded to some of the community needs, and that was hosted by our school. And again, I think the active listening that our teachers and I did that day and the personal responses that we gave. I did a lot of home visits that weekend. I did and continue to do so. And then, just being visible in the community and really listening, I think, is the key word that I would take away, which is what is so important. You can advance to the next slide. So what we learned, I would say that social media is definitely a tool. What we learned about this instance in particular is that we need to educate both students and staff on how to use it appropriately during an emergency event like this. Students need support immediately following and long after, because processing occurs at different rates for some of these students. Obviously, there were a lot of students that attended the funeral. There were a lot of students that were very angry. There were a lot of students that were scared. Family members were scared. So it takes time. Healing, obviously, again, is a process, and sometimes that process takes a lot of time. So the idea that all of this occurs at different rates is important, and I think as leaders of youth, we need to be very mindful of the fact that listening is sometimes the best tool that we can utilize in order to make kids feel safe. And therefore, student voices and perspectives are vital, and they continue to be vital for us to go through the healing process as a school community. Educating our staff on the emergency proceedings before the students start school, that was something that we did. We were able to go through one fire drill the Thursday before this occurred, but what that did is that that caused us to do a little reflection on how we responded, obviously taking teachers through what to do in the case of an emergency, in the case of a lockdown, in the case of a drill where you have to evacuate the building. That's extremely important. The high expectations and accountability that we have for students and staff during those drills are necessary, and we were able to, go through the day ensuring that all the students were safe. And then obviously the professional part about reflecting on your processes, your responses, seeking the feedback and considering input from all of the stakeholders really does assist you in going through and building community through events such as what we had to endure.
Kathy, can we get you in on the conversation? Kathy?
Yes, I'm here. Yes. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. In listening to our previous speaker, I know that some of those events, and like he said, we would hope that they would never happen, but unfortunately they do happen. And then I want to think about on a different scale that we do have tragic local, national, and international events that really impact our students. And so that is what I really want to focus on today. Advance the slide. So my background is I'm the supervisor of K-12 social studies for Arlington Public Schools, right outside of Washington, D.C. I spent 30 years in the classroom and have been at central office for 7 years. We have a K-12 population of 24,000, but we're also from 96 nations, and our students speak 81 languages. So we're a very diverse community. And because the Pentagon really is at the border of our county, we were a school system that was directly impacted by the events of 9/11. In fact, our students in some of our South Arlington schools saw the planes literally going by as the plane heading into the Pentagon. So certainly we know firsthand the impact of tragedy on an international tragedy, national tragedy on a school system. And what I want to really talk about is how we deal with it in our classroom pedagogy and working with students. Advanced slide. First of all, we have some challenges. And the challenges that we face is that we do have students from a diversity of backgrounds that have a diversity of perspectives. And what we want to think about is that how can we turn that diversity into a positive, and how can we use that diversity in our pedagogy and how we work with students to allow those diverse perspectives to help us deal with some of these events. The other thing that we know that Kirk also mentioned is that students are bombarded by social media. You see anybody walking around and they have their cell phones and they have their iPads and they're often looking down, and they get a lot of bombardment of social media. And we know that some of the social media is factual, but also it can be inaccurate. And in the case of tragic events, be they something that occurs locally or even all the way up to an international level, that a lot of times information is put out that's not valid information. And so we are no longer the gatekeepers of information. We have to help students by being the sense makers of that information. And then we also have the challenge in events not just local but all the way up to international. We have students that may be directly and indirectly impacted by tragic events. For example, in 9/11, I was a classroom teacher when that occurred, and I had a student sitting in my class that day whose father was in a meeting at the World Trade Center. And fortunately for that student, the father was running late that morning and did not go into the building because he was late. But, we don't even realize sometimes, because we live in such a global community, how our students might be impacted by events. So we want to talk about preparing. So next slide. The first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that our teachers are prepared. So we want to encourage not just social studies teachers, which is where I'm coming from, but that we have guest speakers and we have resources that educate teachers on current events so that they're equipped with accurate information. That could be encouraging teachers to be aware. I know that personally I read a magazine called The Week every week because it gives a very quick synopsis of current events and provides multiple perspectives, which I think is really important. And I know one of the things that I do in my district is when I plan my fall back to school, I look at what is a current topic, and I make sure that I get a guest speaker to come and talk. And this fall, in August, I chose ISIS because, that was certainly something of concern to my teachers. And my expectation is that I want my teachers to be aware from an expert of this particular topic so that they can respond to the students with accurate information. The other thing that's really important in preparing teachers to deal with terrorism and other tragic events is to encourage that they are teaching multiple perspectives. So complex issues do have multiple viewpoints. And we want to make sure that students are exposed to and have an opportunity to discuss these multiple viewpoints. The next thing as far as preparing is we want to have strategies that encourage discussion. When events like this happen and we're bringing in multiple perspectives and we're talking about current events with students, we don't want the expert to be just the sharer of information. We want our teachers, our guest speakers, to facilitate the discussion. And so using strategies such as Socratic seminars, where students have documents and they talk about them, or structured academic controversies, where students have an opportunity to talk about what they're learning and what they're hearing, and then compare it with accurate facts or multiple perspectives, is really important. So our first big step is making sure that our teachers prepare for discussions that they might have in the classroom with students. Next slide. So when a tragic event occurs, one of the most important things, and once again, Kirk references it, the students have to be allowed to express their emotions and their understandings about the event. They are coming into our schools, which are safe environments where we can discuss situations like this, but they come into our schools, they have a lot that they've maybe heard, and as I mentioned before, it could be true information, it could be inaccurate information, but we want them to express their emotion. You know, and recently in the tragedy in Paris, our students, many of our students were coming in like, if it can happen in Paris, it can happen in Washington, D.C. So what do we know? Does that mean that we stop going to things? You know, should we go to this football game? Should we go for the tour over in D.C.? And so it's really important for teachers to allow students the space to talk about their emotions and talk about their understandings of the event. The next thing is that we can reassure our students that the adults are doing everything in their power to keep them safe. Certainly we know that there's events that happen in our world that are beyond our control, but students need to know that adults do work to keep them safe and that they are working in the community. This is especially important in our younger grades because students in our younger grades may not well be aware of more of the facts that some of our older students might have. The next thing that we want to do is make sure that our students have accurate and age-appropriate facts about the event. So, for example, the morning of the Paris attacks, one of the first things that I did upon arriving to work on Monday was send out an email to my teachers, both elementary and secondary, letting them know that here are some places where you can get some accurate information. I referred them to a place that had a student-friendly video about the event, and then I gave them some strategies of how they may talk about it and encourage them, if students come in, that you need to provide them the space and time to discuss the event. And I think it's also really important that we're very cognizant of the fact that we have students that often are directly impacted by the event and may need extra support. To give you an example, once again from 9/11, we had many students in our school that were Muslim, and they were very concerned. And I would expect, even though I wasn't in for the Paris tragedy, I would expect that the latest outcry related to Muslims would have impacted those students now too. But I know that I had parents that had where I had students and the parents did not want them to stay after school because they were worried about them being, you know, walking home. And so it's really important for us to practice tolerance in the schools, be cognizant of these students, and really put those issues out in the open to be discussed so that we're not, we're helping students to grapple with the fact that the actions of a few do not define the beliefs or the values of many. And so that is, like I said, we are sense makers as adults in helping students to understand these events. We also want to make sure that we expand students' inquiry and the questions that they might have into larger context. So, for example, while a student might want to know how did ISIS form or why did ISIS form, we can address that, but perhaps we can even take that to a higher level of why do people take violent actions, because certainly some of these events do transcend time and place, and so we want to make sure that that is brought forward for the students. And so it's really important when a tragedy event occurs that we have information. We also tap into resources. Similar to Kirk, of reaching out to what are the resources in the community that can help him. We know that within our school, our counselors step forward in events like this. We have outside agencies that we can call on, and we want to make sure that we are reaching out to those people that can support our students. Next slide. So in addition to things that you're going to do when events happen, there's just some really ongoing best practices that really I encourage in social studies, and I do think they go beyond social studies to other disciplines. And one is including the teaching of current events in regular instruction. So as I mentioned several times, social media, we have students that have information now at their fingertips. And so current events is more prevalent in their life, and we have plenty of opportunities in social studies to connect current events to historical events, but it's also important for students to have an opportunity to talk about current events in their classes, make sense of them. I've seen teachers in my district that they basically go through the class and assign each student a different day to report on a current event. And it's not a big, huge class assignment, but every day they have somebody that's coming in and giving them updates. There's student news programs that students can have access with. So just giving them this information and giving it to them in a way that they're getting factual information and have an opportunity to discuss it. Additionally, really making sure that when we are teaching anything that's controversial, that our students see the different viewpoints and that our stories and our narratives are presented from multiple perspectives so that students have an opportunity to understand different viewpoints. And then always to our ongoing best practices are what are the practices that allow students to have conversations in the classroom to explore and discuss content. One of the things that I often say to my teachers is when you think about your classroom, you want to know who is doing the most talking, who is doing the most thinking, and who is doing the most creating, and you really want that to be the student. And so when you put in pedagogy that allows for more student talk and for more student thinking, then you're able to have students have a frame of reference and have some skills and tools at their immediately when they have to make sense of some of these events that might happen to them. Next slide. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the resources that I have identified that have been helpful for my teachers. I want to just highlight just a few of them. The World Affairs Council, I use the one in D.C., but I know World Affairs Councils are throughout the United States. And one of the things that is a great joy is that their speakers come free of charge to talk to, because a lot of times it's hard to find experts that are willing to, but when I identify a topic and I contact them, they have been able to provide speakers. So I've had a speaker on the Ukraine, I've had a speaker on ISIS, I've had a speaker on women's rights throughout the world, and so that's a great resource. The other one that, if people aren't familiar, the Teaching Tolerance resource, there's a magazine that comes out, and it's a free subscription. It provides opportunities for teachers to learn strategies they can use and a lot of free kits that really address some of the issues of tolerance. And so having those resources. The other ones are just places where teachers can go and they can get multiple perspectives and different viewpoints on events. And if you go to these right now, for example, the Paris attacks, you're going to find that every one of those organizations really address the events and provide students multiple perspectives and also lessons so that a teacher is able to implement some classroom structured activity related to these events. And then I put down some current event sites for students that teachers might use. For example, CNN.com does a news broadcast that's at the student level, and it really takes important news events and makes it understandable to students. So I would encourage the using of resources to try to implement the pedagogy that will help our students become critical thinkers that will allow them to navigate when they have to deal with some of these issues that we would hope that none of them would have to deal with. And that is it for me, but I'm more than happy to take questions as we move on.
Okay, I see we have a few questions that have come in, and one is concerning the sites that you have for students there. Have those sites been vetted so that you know they're safe for students?
Yeah, these are all very specific for students. Yes, they are designed for students. So that if you were to go on to like CNN or Time for Kids, these are affiliated with their, like Time Magazine and CNN, but they are designed specifically to be used with students.
Okay, thank you. Next question coming in. Kurt, this looks like a question for you. And the question is, how has the tragedy at your school changed your school environment?
Well, I would obviously be lying if I didn't say it didn't affect us. I think it's made us definitely more aware of some of the things that may be occurring in our school community that may come in to the school that affect students from a multitude of arenas. A lot of times, as any school administrator can attest, some things that happen over the weekend or that happen on Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever, they trickle into the school and they become school issues. So I think it's made us take a broader view of school safety. It also has made us more aware of some of the things, as I said earlier. Our school is an older school, so it's caused us to take a look at some of the things that we have and don't have from a technological standpoint, just by virtue of how old our building is and the ability to communicate and receive messages in as well as have messages go out. So that's been something that I've had to take on as a leadership role and be able to make sure that just because our school was built in 1976 does not mean that we should not have the tools and accessibility that schools that were built last year or 2 or 3 years ago also have. But from a school culture perspective, I think again it's caused us to be better listeners and really listen to the student voices and listen to their perspectives. I think a lot of times we as adults make assumptions that we are doing and making decisions that are great for kids, and a lot of times we forget to get those kids' perspectives and ask them truly, how does this decision that we're making affect you? And maybe how better could we be responding to some of the needs that you may know that are needed right now, and also how can we respond to some of those things that maybe you're afraid to bring up or you're afraid not to voice your opinion. So I think it's made us closer, if that makes sense. I like to think that we are a family, and I think it's definitely caused us to take reflection in what that means as a staff and as a school community.
This next question has to do with best practices. And Kathy, I know you're the supervisor for social studies, but can you address how can teachers, other than those in the social studies, apply best practices?
Yeah, I think that we look for teachable moments, and we have a sense, and I think that can apply in any classroom. And so I think it's really important for all teachers to be informed. I think the teaching of current events and the discussion of things that happen out in the community we do not own that in social studies. And so I would encourage that all schools would be able to, find ways. For example, when you go into a health and PE class, you certainly talk about safety, and current events and discussions about that can be brought in that. So, it may be that we have students that maybe would not even encounter on the day that they want to talk about something. They would not even encounter a social studies teacher. And so I think it's all teachers really taking advantage of teachable moments and at the source of when these events happen, providing students voice and discussion and letting their emotions be heard and being able in a very constructive way to help students make sense of what they are learning or what they are hearing. And I believe that that really goes beyond just a social studies classroom. It really could be done at any in any classroom, for sure.
Given our current environment and the recent current events with Paris and the San Bernardino attacks, um, what impact has this global terrorism had on your students or on your communities?
I think it definitely it makes us realize that we're very vulnerable. You know, and I could take that from the personal perspective that obviously what happened in my community could happen in anywhere at any time to any person. But you know, I think what's happened across the world is just really it echoes and makes us realize how vulnerable we are to certain things, and a lot of those things are out of our control. And I think that it's very important for us to, like Kathy said, be very open-minded about how we assist students in responding to these current events, and many of them, you know, that we're talking about today are very tragic. But because we also have to understand that you know, they are developing their own emotional maturity. They're developing, you know, their cognitive maturity and their ability to understand some of the greater issues that some of them may never encounter personally, but the questions that they come up with was, you know, just the basic, why is this happening, or why did this have to happen in my school, or why did this have to happen in my state or my neighborhood or my country or whatever. But I think it really resonates with a lot of our population, at least that we're serving here, the vulnerability that that we have, you know, on a daily basis.
And to just add on to that, I agree with Kirk. It gives us really a heightened sense of, could this happen to me? And I think it may be in our district also more focus on who are the students that are sitting in front of us and how is it impacting them, because certainly when you are teaching in a school system that has such a diversity within the school system, and we know that that is the case in many places across the United States, but you know, they sometimes are very directly affected by these events, and there's a lot of nuances that, you know, we need to be aware of, because in schools we want to create these safe environments for our students to thrive. And so I think it's really important for educators to have a real awareness of what's going on in the world and how it might impact what's going on in the classroom. And, you know, that includes, you know, one of the things that I do is I do read a lot of social media. I read a lot of what's on Twitter. I follow Facebook sites to see what people are saying out there, because those are the same things that my students are going to bring in the classroom. And there is with a diversity of students, just being aware. And so our job as adults becomes to be more, ever more vigilant of being, you know, being aware of what's going on so that we can support the students, because we, as we have learned, Kirk learned in his school, and as we've learned with these events that have happened at a national and international level, a lot of what's happening in the world comes right into our classrooms. And so it's important for us to be aware and be able to respond and to help our students make sense.
Okay. And I see we have another question here. How can the school community help students deal with the current events that are taking place, the fear that I'm sure all of us are feeling as we are looking at social media and seeing the evening news?
I think, you know, Kathy did a really good job about explaining how we as educational leaders can assist teachers in developing activities that cause students to critically think and consider perspectives in a lot of the stuff that is going around. You know, both Kathy and I are very fortunate to be in an area where we are kind of at the hub of our local news really becomes national news or is national news. And so I think it's taking advantage of those resources and surrounding your teachers and your students with those resources and educating, obviously, the teachers on how to use those resources responsibly, but also then being able to build those relationships and make sure that your staff is responding on a personal level and allowing for the opportunity for students to ask questions and seek beyond just what they may read or what they may hear or what they may see on the news, but really to seek some understanding. You know, the great opportunities that we have as teachers is to learn from our students, and you know, as Kathy made the comment about being in a diverse community, that's one of the things that I love about being at the high school that I'm at, is that I get to learn from the students, because they have, some of them have had to endure things that I can't even imagine just to get into the state of Virginia, and then you know, imagining what they've had to go, the feat that they've had to go through to get to the state of Virginia, and then want to come to school and want to learn English or biology or algebra. And so sometimes I really force my staff to reflect on the stories that these students could tell and how we can learn from the stories and the perspectives that they bring to our classrooms each and every day. So I think it's just really making sure that we allow for that reflective time for kids to process, because whether it's an individual you know, tragic event, or it's an event, you know, like we've seen in Paris and in California, we have to be able to give our students the tools to respond to those and process them in a healthy way.
And we talk a lot in our district about culturally responsive teaching, and that is really being very aware of the students, like as I said, sitting in front of you and making sure that their voices are heard. I think it's also important, I think sometimes we get really caught up in the accountability of, you know, we have curriculum to cover, we have test schedules and things like that, and it's really important that we as leaders provide our teachers with the understanding that there are times that you need to make space and time for teachable moments, and that, you know, students that are not feeling that they're in a safe environment and they've been able to make sense of something that's really troubling them, it's very difficult to move on. And so I think it's really important to be responsive to the needs of our students, because productive learning can only take place when students feel that they're in a safe environment where they're valued and respected. And so I think it's important that we can help to create that kind of environment and be culturally responsive to the needs of our students when something like this does occur.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions, so I am going to put up contact information for both Kathy and Kirk, and should anyone in the audience wish to reach out, you can certainly email them. And with that, I think that concludes our presentation for today. I'd like to thank both Kathy Hicks and Kirk Dolson for their time and their input into this important topic. And I've got one other thing I'd like to bring to the audience's attention, and that is to extend an invitation to join your colleagues in Orlando on February 25th through the 27th for NASSP's annual conference, Ignite 16. You can learn about the conference and registration at the address shown on this slide. So we look forward to seeing you all there. And this webinar will be recorded, has been recorded, and will be accessible on our website. So thank you all for joining us today. And again, thanks to Kathy and to Kirk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For the opportunity.
Thank you.